My name is Margaret Monroe, and the day I found out my wedding ring had been sold, the world tilted like a picture frame coming loose from the wall. It didn't crash or break, just hung there, crooked, daring me to fix it. 3 months had passed since Frank's funeral, long enough for the casseroles to stop coming and the phone calls to fade. I thought I was ready to clean out his desk, ready to touch the traces he left behind. I was wrong. The drawer stuck halfway swollen with old papers and dust. When it finally gave, something thin slipped to the floor, a pawn ticket. I might have tossed it with the rest of the junk if the words hadn't caught my eye. 14K gold ring engraved, yours always. My chest went tight. That was our ring. The date printed on the slip was March 3rd, 1 week before Frank died. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe he'd taken it for repair. Maybe a clerk made a mistake. But the signature at the bottom wasn't his. It curved wrong, confident where Frank's hand had trembled in those final months. I stared at that forgery until the paper blurred, until grief gave way to suspicion. Outside, a spring breeze rattled the wind chime he'd hung by the porch years ago. I remembered him saying, "Whenever that rings, it means I'm still around." I wanted to believe it. But that sound felt hollow now, like someone else had borrowed it. I called the number printed on the slip, Miller's Pawn and Loan, Bloomington. A man answered, voice rough from cigarettes. When I asked about the ring, he didn't even need to check. "Yeah, I remember that one," he said. "Guy came in early March, said his wife passed and he couldn't stand looking at the ring anymore. Real polite. Paid him cash." My throat went dry. Did he give his name? He hesitated. Paper rustled. "Says here, J. Porter." Jack Porter. Frank's best friend. The man who carried his casket, who clapped my shoulder at the graveside and whispered, "You're not alone, Maggie." The room seemed to tilt again. I hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the one Frank built himself, staring at the empty groove on my finger. The ring had never been expensive, just real gold worn thin, from years of dishwater and gardening, the engraving nearly faded smooth. But now it wasn't just gone. It had been sold. Sleep didn't come. Around midnight, I made coffee and flipped through an old photo album, Frank and Jack at a fishing derby, laughing with beer cans in their hands. I traced Jack's face with my finger, trying to understand. Maybe it was desperation, maybe debt. But the thought of him walking into that pawn shop, pretending his wife had passed, signing that paper? It was a lie with fingerprints. By morning, I'd made up my mind. Grief could wait. Bloomington was waking up slow when I parked outside Miller's Pawn. Neon letters buzzed weakly behind the glass. Inside smelled like metal and regret. The man at the counter, Levine, his tag said, looked surprised when I showed him the receipt. "You Mrs. Porter?" he asked. I almost laughed. "No, I'm the woman whose ring you bought." He frowned, glanced between the paper and me. "Well, ma'am, the sale was legal. Guy had ID, said the ring was his." Did he look like this? I slid a photo from my wallet, Frank and Jack at that same derby. Levine squinted, pointed. "That one. Gray hair, steady hands. Nice guy." My stomach turned. Nice guy. The words clanged in my head like a church bell cracked down the middle. "Can I see the ring?" I asked. He hesitated, then unlocked a case behind him. There it was, small, simple, a dull shine under the fluorescent light. I felt dizzy. "I'll be back for it," I said quietly. He nodded. "Take your time, ma'am. It'll be here." Outside, the air smelled like rain and exhaust. I stood there on the sidewalk watching people hurry past, each of them carrying their own invisible griefs. Mine just happened to wear a pawn tag. I drove aimlessly through the old part of town, past the diner where Frank used to order chicken fried steak, past the church, where we'd said our vows. Everything looked the same, but felt counterfeit. When I passed Harlan's bar, I saw Jack's truck parked out front, same dented bumper, same faded Go Hoosiers sticker. I pulled over before I even thought it through. The rain started to fall soft and cold. I sat there watching the neon beer sign flicker in the window, thinking of all the nights Frank and Jack had spent inside, laughing over bourbon and old stories. My hand gripped the pawn ticket so tight the paper wrinkled. I wasn't ready to walk in yet. Not because I was scared of confrontation, because I was scared of what I might still want to believe, that he'd have an explanation, that this was all some misunderstanding. But deep down, I already knew. The first lie after a funeral always starts with, "I didn't mean to." I looked again at my hand on the steering wheel, bare, pale, strange, without that ring. The skin there felt colder than the rest. A space that used to mean forever now meant nothing. By the time the rain stopped, my decision was made. Tomorrow night, same bar. I'd find Jack Porter, and he would explain one way or another. The next evening, the rain had stopped leaving the streets slick and shining like a mirror. The neon sign above Harlan's bar blinked between red and gold, washing the wet pavement in restless color. I parked across the street engine, off watching through the window. Jack Porter sat at the counter, the same seat he'd always taken beside Frank. The stool beside him was empty. Maybe it had been waiting for me. I sat there for a minute, feeling the tremor in my hands. My pulse wasn't from fear anymore. It was from purpose. Inside the jukebox hummed something slow and nostalgic, the kind of song that made people remember what they lost. I pushed open the door and stepped into the smell of bourbon and fried onions. The bartender looked up and gave a polite nod. Jack turned, and the moment his eyes met mine, his smile faltered. "Maggie," he said, standing halfway as if unsure whether to hug me or run. "I didn't expect. I'm sure you didn't." My voice was calm, even friendly. "Mind if I sit?" He gestured to the stool. The bartender poured him another drink without asking. "Frank would have wanted us to stay friends," Jack said carefully. "We've both been through." I slid the pawn ticket across the bar, face up. The paper looked small under the yellow light, but it carried the weight of every truth he'd buried. His hand froze on the glass. "What's that?" "You tell me," I said. He stared at the slip for a long time, then exhaled hard. "You shouldn't believe everything you find, Maggie. Frank, he told me to handle things. Said he didn't want you burdened with." I cut him off. "He could barely walk, Jack. He didn't ask you to sell our ring." A muscle twitched in his jaw. The bartender suddenly found a reason to step away, leaving us alone in the dim light. The jukebox clicked off, and silence filled the air like static. "I was going to buy it back," Jack said quietly. "Just needed a little time. Things have been rough since the funeral." "Rough." I leaned closer, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. "You stood next to his grave and told me he was the best man you ever knew. Then you took the one thing he left me and traded it for a bar tab." He winced like I'd slapped him. "I made a mistake." "No," I said, voice low. "You made a choice." For a moment, his eyes softened. "I thought you'd moved on, Maggie. You weren't wearing it anymore." I stared at him. Because it didn't fit after the chemo wait. Not because it didn't matter. He looked away, shame creeping up his neck. "I'll get it back," he muttered. "Tomorrow." "You won't have to," I said, standing. "I already did." He blinked. "You what?" "I bought it back this morning," I said. "With Frank's change jar. You remember that jar, don't you? The one labeled vacation fund. Funny how the same money that once took us to the ocean now bought back what you sold for bourbon." Jack's face went pale. Maggie, I'm sorry. I nodded. I know, but sorry doesn't make you decent again. The words hung there heavy as thunder. I picked up his half-empty glass and looked at it. Sweet bourbon, isn't it? I said softly. Funny thing about sweetness, it turns bitter if you leave it sitting too long. Then I set the glass down and walked out. Outside, the night air felt sharp and clean. The rain had stopped completely. I walked to my car without looking back, the pawn ticket burning like paper fire in my coat pocket. Driving home through the quiet streets of Bloomington, I passed places that once meant comfort. The diner, the church, the old hardware store Frank loved. Everything felt different. But for the first time, I wasn't drowning in grief. I was standing in it, breathing through it. When I reached home, I placed the ring on the kitchen table under the lamp. The engraving, "Yours always," caught the light faint, but still there. I didn't put it on. Instead, I just sat and watched it gleam. Maybe revenge wasn't about screaming or breaking things. Maybe it was just taking back what was yours and letting someone else live with what they'd done. The porch light flickered outside. I turned it on and left it burning just like Frank always did when he was waiting for me to come home. The next morning, sunlight crept through the curtains, glinting off the ring that still sat on the kitchen table. It looked out of place now, a perfect circle in a life that had broken its shape. I picked it up, turned it over, and for a moment thought about sliding it back onto my finger. But something in me hesitated. Once that ring had meant promise. Now it just felt heavy. I tucked it into my pocket and drove toward the edge of town. Harlan's bar looked the same in daylight, tired, ordinary, almost innocent. But I wasn't going there to see Jack again. I was going to see Greg, the bar's owner, and an old friend of Frank's. He was one of those men who saw everything but never said much. When he spotted me at the doorway, his brow furrowed. "Maggie," he said softly, wiping his hands on a rag. "You all right?" "I just need a minute," I said. "It's about Jack." He led me to a booth near the window. The bar smelled faintly of bleach and coffee, the scent of mornings trying to wash away last night's sins. I handed him the pawn ticket and waited while he read it. His eyes darkened. "I figured something was off," Greg said. "Jack's been late on his rent for months, borrowed from everyone who'd still answer his calls. I told him he needed help. Guess this is how he found it." "Did Frank ever talk to you about him?" I asked. Greg nodded. "They had a fight right before Frank got sick. Something about money. Frank said he was done bailing Jack out. He said, 'A man who drinks away every second chance doesn't deserve another.'" I exhaled slowly. Sounds like Frank. Greg looked at me carefully. "You planning to press charges?" I shook my head. "No. He didn't just steal a ring, he stole my last illusion. I'll take that as payment." Greg nodded, not arguing. Before I left, he said, "Be careful, Maggie. Guilt makes men unpredictable." Outside, the sky had turned gray again, the kind that felt like it might never clear. I drove home, past the cemetery. Frank's name gleamed faintly on the headstone through the drizzle. For a second, I thought about stopping, then decided not to. He didn't need my tears. He needed my strength. That afternoon, I went through the rest of his desk searching for something to anchor myself. Beneath tax papers and an old fishing license, I found his notebook. He'd used it for quotes, thoughts, reminders, pieces of himself in blue ink. On the last page, written in his careful, slanted handwriting, were the words, "A promise kept is heavier than gold." I ran my thumb across the ink until it smudged slightly. That's when the idea started forming, not revenge, but balance. The next day, I drove back to Miller's Pawn. Mr. Levine looked up from his counter, surprised to see me again. "Back already?" he asked. "Yes, I wanted to pay off the rest of the fee for the ring." He smiled kindly. Already done, ma'am. I set it aside for you. Nobody else touches it. I took a breath. Can you do me a favor? If that man ever comes back, Jack Porter, tell him the ring found its way home, and tell him it didn't need his help. Mr. Levine's smile faded into something more thoughtful. You sure about that? Completely. I left with the ring in my purse, the receipt torn in half. On the drive home, the radio played an old country song Frank used to hum under his breath while fixing the porch steps. It made me smile, not because I missed him, but because I finally understood him. When I reached home, I walked to the backyard. The garden was still muddy from rain tulip shoots just breaking through the soil. Frank always said flowers didn't care about yesterday, they only grew toward the light. I knelt down and buried the pawn receipt under the first patch of new green. That's done, I whispered. That evening, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat on the porch. The light in the window behind me flickered warm against the glass. Across the street, Jack's truck rolled slowly by. He didn't stop, just stared straight ahead. But he saw me, and I saw the shadow in his face. Good, I thought. Let him feel what silence sounds like. Inside, the phone rang once. I didn't move to answer. Some words didn't need to be heard anymore. The phone rang again the next morning, longer this time. I let it go to voicemail thinking it was another neighbor checking in, maybe church ladies reminding me about Sunday potluck. But when the message light blinked, something in me made me listen. Maggie, it's Jack. His voice was rough, slower than usual. I need to talk. Please. Just 5 minutes. I deleted it without replying, but his voice lingered in the quiet house like the smell of old smoke. You couldn't see it, but it stayed. I spent the morning cleaning the kind of pointless cleaning you do when your mind won't stop turning. Every sound in the house seemed louder. The fridge hummed the creak of the floorboards. Even the clock ticking all of it reminded me that silence wasn't peace. It was waiting. By noon, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to run from him. If Jack wanted to talk, he could do it on my terms. I drove to his place on the outskirts of town, a sagging blue house with a yard full of weeds. The blinds were half drawn, and a rusted pickup sat in the driveway. When I knocked, there was a pause, then the sound of shuffling feet. Jack opened the door, eyes red-rimmed, wearing the same flannel shirt from the bar. Maggie, he said quietly, you came. I said 5 minutes, I replied. He stepped aside, motioning me in. The house smelled of stale beer and dust. A few dishes sat in the sink mail piled high on the table. He looked smaller somehow, like the walls had been pressing in on him since the night at the bar. I was going to return it, he said before I even sat down. I swear. I didn't mean. Stop saying you didn't mean to, I interrupted. You walked into a pawn shop, signed my husband's name, and sold something that wasn't yours. You meant it every step of the way. He rubbed his face, voice cracking. I was drowning, Maggie. After Frank died, I thought, maybe I don't know. Maybe if I had something of his, I could hang on. Then the bills kept coming, and You pawned the one thing that meant we still existed, I said. That ring wasn't just gold, Jack. It was 28 years of love fights and forgiveness. You sold our history for whiskey money. He sank into a chair, head in his hands. I know, and I hate myself for it. I stood by the doorway, arms folded. Good. You should. He looked up, eyes wet. What do you want me to do? I don't want anything from you, I said flatly. I already got the ring back. The only thing left is for you to live with what you did. He nodded slowly, like someone taking a sentence instead of a suggestion. Frank was right about me, he muttered. He said one day I'd drink away the last good thing in my life. He was right, I said. And now you get to sober up with the truth. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. Maggie, please, can I at least pay you back? I owe you that much. I hesitated at the door. You can't buy redemption, Jack. You earn it. When I stepped outside, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells from downtown midweek service, maybe. I stood on his porch for a long moment, watching the sky darken with incoming rain. Driving home, I realized I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow, like revenge had burned too fast and left nothing but smoke. But maybe that was what healing really looked like. Ugly, uneven, unfinished. That evening, I went to the backyard to check on the tulips. The first one had bloomed pale yellow, fragile, stubborn against the chill. I crouched down and touched its stem, wondering how something so soft could survive the cold. Later, I found myself at Frank's old writing desk again. I pulled out his notebook and flipped to a blank page. My handwriting looked steadier than I expected as I wrote. When someone steals what you loved most, don't steal it back. Reclaim it by becoming stronger than the pain. I closed the notebook, set it by the lamp, and turned off the light. The next morning, I mailed an envelope to Greg, the bar owner. Inside were copies of the pawn ticket and my statement about what Jack had done. No police, no charges, just truth. I asked Greg to keep it safe in case Jack ever forgets why the bottle isn't worth it. That night, Jack left another message. "You were right," he said softly. "I poured it all out, the whiskey, the lies. I hope someday you can forgive me." I didn't reply. Some things didn't need words. Forgiveness wasn't a phone call. It was time, and I still had plenty of that. As I locked the front door, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. For the first time in months, I didn't look broken, just different. I went to bed wearing no ring, but with peace in its place. The morning air carried that quiet kind of cold that seeps through window cracks and settles in your bones. I brewed coffee and stood by the kitchen window watching the steam curl upward like something escaping. On the table beside me sat the ring, small, gold, ordinary, yet heavier than it had ever been. I still hadn't decided what to do with it. Wearing it again felt wrong, but tucking it away felt cowardly. I needed to move to do something that meant forward. So I put on my coat, pocketed the ring, and drove to the courthouse in downtown Bloomington. The stone building looked exactly the same as the day Frank and I signed our first mortgage. Life had a way of looping back on itself whether you were ready or not. Inside the clerk, a woman about my age named Pauline smiled politely. "Can I help you?" "I need to verify a record," I said. "A pawn transaction. I'm not filing charges, just need to document ownership." Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't question me. "We can do that. I'll need a statement for the record." I handed over the torn pawn receipt and my driver's license. When she looked up again, her face softened. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Monroe. Must have been something special." "It was," I said quietly. While she printed forms, I studied the courthouse walls lined with framed photos of judges and city founders. Ordinary faces of people who once thought they could set the world straight. I wondered how many wrongs they'd missed along the way. When the paperwork was done, Pauline slid a copy toward me. "You'll get confirmation in the mail," she said. "You don't have to come back in person." "I think I needed to," I replied. Back outside, the sun was bright, but distant. I walked across the square to the small public library where I'd volunteered years ago. Mrs. Heller, the librarian, recognized me instantly. "Margaret, haven't seen you since the book drive. How are you holding up?" "Getting there," I said, with a smile that almost felt real. "I actually need some help. Do you still keep public archives?" She led me to the back where the air smelled of dust and time. I told her I wanted to know more about pawn shops, how they were regulated, who kept the records. She didn't ask why. She just fetched a binder thick as a family Bible. As I flipped through the pages, I found something unexpected, a section about recovered items donated to charity auctions after owners reclaimed them, jewelry, watches, instruments, all given new meaning instead of collecting dust. That idea stayed with me. Maybe that's what I needed to do, give the ring a purpose bigger than the story attached to it. Driving home, I passed Miller's Pawn again. The open sign blinked in the window. Impulse made me stop. Mr. Levine looked surprised, but pleased. Mrs. Monroe, good to see you again. I came to say thank you, I said, for being decent when others weren't. He smiled. Just doing my job, ma'am. That ring meant something to you. Glad you got it back. I hesitated. Would you happen to know if there's a charity that helps widows or older women around here? Something local? He thought for a moment. There's the Monroe County Widow Relief Fund, small thing, mostly church-backed. They help pay legal fees or rent after a loss. Why? I think I'd like to make a donation, I said. He nodded, understanding without prying. Good idea. Sometimes turning a bad story into a better one's the best kind of revenge. That night, I sat at Frank's desk again, the ring lying in the center of a blank envelope. I wrote a note to help another woman keep what's hers. The next morning, I dropped it off at the church office anonymously. The secretary, a gray-haired woman knitting behind the counter, didn't even ask for my name. She just smiled and said, "Bless you." For the first time in months, the word didn't sting. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I made dinner for one roast chicken, mashed potatoes, Frank's favorite. Not out of longing, but remembrance. When I sat at the table, I poured a second glass of tea the way I used to for him and left it untouched. Halfway through the meal, headlights flickered outside. Through the window, I saw Jack's truck idling by the curb. He didn't come to the door this time. After a moment, he placed a small box on my porch and drove off. Inside the box was cash neatly counted, the same amount the pawnshop had paid. On top of it lay a folded note for the ring, for the truth, for the man I betrayed. I didn't take the money. I placed it in an envelope and dropped it in the church's donation box the next morning. That night, I slept without dreams. 2 days later, I found the envelope from the courthouse in my mailbox. Inside was the stamped record confirming ownership of the ring, proof that the world had finally caught up with the truth. I set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a while, feeling neither anger nor triumph. Just quiet. Bloomington was waking from winter, and the smell of thawing earth drifted through the open window. I decided to drive into town for groceries, anything to feel normal again. At the store, people nodded hello, neighbors who had whispered about me at the funeral. Now smiled the way small towns do when they sense a story has found its ending. But my story wasn't finished yet. That evening, as I watered the garden, Greg pulled up in his truck. He climbed out slowly, carrying an envelope. "Jack asked me to give you this," he said. I sighed. Let me guess, another apology. Maybe Greg said, or maybe the last word he'll ever have. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper smelled faintly of smoke and bourbon. "Maggie, you were right about me. I took something that wasn't mine, and in doing it, I lost what little I had left of Frank and of myself. I've stopped drinking. I'm selling the truck and leaving town for a while. Maybe there's still a chance to do something decent before I go. If you can forgive me. If you can't, I understand. Jack." I read it twice, folded it carefully, and set it under a flower pot on the porch. Forgiveness wasn't a word I could mail back. It had to grow slow as spring. The following week, the pastor at my church stopped me after service. "Margaret, I heard about your donation. The Widow Relief Fund is going to help 3 women pay their legal bills this month." I smiled. "That's good news, Pastor. The ring found its purpose after all." He nodded. Sometimes God uses our hurt to fix someone else's. That night, I sat on the porch again, with a cup of tea, the evening sky painted in soft blues and oranges. Across the street, the porch lights flickered on one by one like quiet prayers. I thought about Frank, how he believed that people weren't defined by their mistakes but by what they did afterward. Maybe Jack would find his way, maybe not. Either way, I was done carrying his burden. Inside, I placed the court record beside Frank's notebook. On its last page, I wrote one more line. Closure isn't the end of love, it's the beginning of peace. Months passed. The garden grew wild and bright. Women from the Widow Fund sent thank you notes, each one a small reminder that something good had come from something broken. Then one afternoon, I got a call from Greg. "You might want to sit down," he said. Jack turned himself in last week. He confessed about forging Frank's name, said it was time to face what he'd done. I sat quietly for a moment, staring out the window at the tulips swaying in the wind. "Thank you for telling me," I said. After we hung up, I felt no shock, no satisfaction, just a steady calm. Maybe the universe really did balance itself out, even if it took its time. That evening, I walked down to the churchyard. The wind carried the sound of bells from the old tower as I knelt by Frank's grave. I brushed the dust from his name, the letters catching the sunset. "It's over, Frank," I whispered. "You were right. Promises are heavier than gold." The wind picked up, lifting a few petals from the tulips and scattering them across the grass. I smiled. When I got home, I turned on the porch light. It glowed against the dusk, steady and warm. I left it on, not for Jack, not even for Frank, but for every woman who's ever been told her story was over when it was only just beginning. And as the night settled around my little house in Indiana, I finally felt what I hadn't in months, peace that didn't need to be proven. Spring turned into summer, and the town moved on. I could feel it in the slow rhythm of the streets, in the laughter from the diner patio, in the scent of cut grass drifting through my open windows. Life was ordinary again, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like a blessing. One afternoon, I got a call from the Widow Relief Fund. Mrs. Monroe, the woman said, her voice bright with gratitude. "Your donation helped 3 widows avoid eviction this month. We're naming a small grant in your husband's honor, the Frank Monroe Assistance Fund." I didn't know what to say at first. My throat tightened, but I smiled. He'd like that, I managed. He believed in fixing what was broken. That night I lit a candle by Frank's photo. The ring was gone now, donated, repurposed, freed. What stayed was lighter than gold, but stronger than grief. A few days later, Greg stopped by. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photo Jack, standing outside a rehab center. Thinner, sober, eyes clear. There was a note scrawled on the back, "Still sober, still trying. Thank you for not hating me." I sat on the porch a long time after Greg left. The sunset was the color of bourbon, but it didn't sting anymore. I thought about how revenge had started this journey, how I'd wanted justice proof, something tangible to match the pain. But somewhere along the way, justice had turned into something else. Compassion. Quiet and stubborn as a seed that refused to die. That Sunday, the pastor asked me to share a few words at church. My knees trembled as I stood at the pulpit, but my voice held steady. "I used to think revenge meant getting even," I said. "But when someone steals from you, your peace, your trust, your love, the best revenge isn't hurting them back. It's refusing to live in the shadow they left. It's turning what they broke into something that helps somebody else stand taller." People nodded, some with tears, some with that look of quiet understanding only loss can teach. After the service, a young woman approached me, clutching a folded pawn ticket of her own. "My husband's brother took my mother's locket after she passed," she said. I didn't know what to do until I heard your story." I took her hand. "Start by forgiving yourself for trusting him. Then take back your story." That evening, I sat on my porch again, tea steaming in my hands. Across the street porch, lights flickered on one by one, tiny beacons in the dusk. Mine glowed brightest, it always did. Frank used to say, "A porch light's not just for coming home. It's for reminding the world that someone still believes in warmth." So I kept it on even when the nights grew long and the wind whispered through the maples. Sometimes when I hear the chime of the wind against the railing, I imagine Frank smiling somewhere proud that I learned what he'd always known, that peace isn't quiet, it's earned. If you've ever been betrayed, don't bury your story. Share it. Let it reach the next woman who's sitting alone at her kitchen table, staring at an empty hand and wondering what to do next. Tell her this: you can lose the ring, the trust, the person, but never the strength to begin again. Because revenge doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply leaves the porch light on,